How are you doing? Welcome to Pete Star TV. Thanks for tuning in. I'm giving you the history of Ireland, the real history of Ireland, narrated by a friend. He's reading out the history of Ireland and it's done with photographs. Enjoy the history of Ireland, Pete Star TV.
Ireland. The island takes its name from the old Irish word Éire, the name of a goddess, a word meaning bountiful or prosperous. The people of this island have ancient roots to it, and its history is likewise long, rich, mysterious, and important. Not only for the Irish, but for the millions of people living across the world whose ancestors came from this island. In this video, we're going to discuss the history of Ireland in full. The story of Druids and Christians, rebels and loyalists, natives and invaders, struggles and successes, all of which made Ireland what it is today. It's likely that Ireland was first inhabited around the year 12,500 BC by hunter-gatherer groups. During this time, sea levels were lower and Ireland belonged to continental Europe geographically. By 4000 BC, farming had likely made its way to the island and become commonplace. Ireland entered the Bronze Age around 2000 BC, being an unfortunate location for this age as it was heavy in copper and near Cornwall, which produced tin. The Iron Age began around 600 BC. It is during the Iron Age that Ireland's modern identity begins to take shape as Celtic peoples from mainland Europe and Britain began migrating to the island and mixing with the indigenous population. Prior to the arrival of the Celts, Ireland was very sparsely inhabited and unorganized. The Celts would bring it on its path toward higher civilization. Four such main waves of Celtic migrations would occur. It was the Celts who had brought the Iron Age to Ireland, along with religion that would form the basis of the paganism of the British Isles, language which would evolve into the modern Irish language, trade connections to the main continent, and the social structure and culture which would dominate the island for centuries. The first writings of the island come from the Greek and Roman explorers who referred to the island under a variety of names and made a number of reports about the island. Though many of these reports were likely false and at times fantastical, they would last in the Roman impressions of the island, giving ancient Ireland, and the Celts in general, a mysterious aura which, truth be told, lasts to this day in a way. The first person to actually give a fairly accurate report of the island was Julius Caesar, who called the island Hibernia, a corruption of the ancient Greek word for the island, the land of the Hiverni, which would come to mean the land of winter, sharing a common root with the word hibernate. Caesar also said that it was located to the west of Britannia and about half its size, one of the most accurate descriptions of Ireland up to that point. Though some Romans, like Agricola, considered it, the Romans would never invade Hibernia, but they did interact, primarily because of Rome's presence on the island of Britain. Archaeological findings of Roman coins on Ireland suggest complex interaction and trade. It's possible that the Romans set up trading outposts in certain areas of Ireland and perhaps military outposts with the purpose of protecting this trade. One such commodity which they traded would have been slaves. The Romans no doubt purchased them from the Irish to work on the agricultural centers of Roman Britain. It is likely that the Irish took part in Roman conflicts as barbarian mercenaries, which was common in the Roman Empire, especially in the later years. They also, likely, were at times raiders and pirates who assaulted the western coast of Britannia, but also settled it. Rome would never invade Hibernia for two main reasons. The first was that there wasn't a major tactical advantage in doing so. It was unknown territory on the border of the known world. It would have been very complicated trying to subdue the island, and the Romans weren't sure what they gained from it economically, strategically, or politically. Accordingly, resources and manpower were better utilized slightly east against the Picts of modern Scotland. The moment Rome moved troops from Britannia to Hibernia, the Picts would likely seize the opportunity and attack. If Rome had ruled the whole island, maybe they would have gone to Ireland as well, though we'll never know. Though there was interaction with the Romans, Ireland was one of the few areas of Western Europe which was allowed primarily to develop on its own. During this time, the Irish relied on small communities of subsistence farming where cattle, or sometimes other goods like slaves, were essentially their form of currency. In some writings, it is said that one slave girl was equal in worth to about 6 cows. They lacked major towns and cities, but they did have early kinds of towns and roads between them, even through bogs and marshes. The island was, as I said, divided among many different tribes who were often at war with each other. A main cause of warfare were these cattle, primarily disputes over ownership and the theft of them. The Celts introduced new power structures to Ireland when they came, and there would have been perhaps 100 to 200 kings across Ireland ruling their own small countries. Due to the land differences in the various tribes, 4 distinct regions would form in Ireland: Ulster, Leinster, Munster, and Connacht. These divisions, dating back to ancient times, last to this day. The final and most notable group of Celts were the Gaels, whose influence would eventually extend across the whole island and even to parts of western Scotland in the 5th century. Their culture and identity would be firmly rooted and permanent in Ireland. To this day, the Irish language calls itself Gaelic, and in English, the word Gaelic is still synonymous with the people and culture of Ireland. Though they did write using an Ogham writing system on stones and wood, the Irish at this time lacked books and literature. Their pagan religion, which was banned by Rome in modern England, thrived there. We don't know a lot about this religion from their perspective, or much about their home and people in this time in general, because of their lack of extensive writing. Much of what we know comes from the Greeks and Romans, and centuries later, Christian monks who recorded tales which were preserved verbally. Naturally, the Romans, who sought to convince their people that they had to conquer the Celts, and the Christians, who sought to convert the pagans, aren't considered the most reliable or honest sources. Thankfully, however, important parts of this time survived which, along with archaeology, allows us to understand them better. The Irish Celts were animistic. They saw spirits in the natural world around them, such as trees, water, rocks, animals, fire, etc., and thus had a deep spiritual connection to the natural world. They worshipped many gods and spirits. Some were local, others were common across Celtic culture. They believed in an otherworld, which could have meant many different things, though it was primarily an afterlife, a world of spirits and the dead. Some said it existed to the west, across the sea, others said it ran parallel to our own world. Sometimes, the barriers between this world and the other world were broken, leading to a number of strange events. To interpret this complex religion were the Dree, known in English as the Druids. The Druids were not only priests, but also legal authorities, leaders, philosophers, historians, and doctors. Oftentimes, they held as much power as the kings whom they advised. One of the more shocking aspects of this paganism was human sacrifice. Though Roman sources likely exaggerated the amount of human sacrifice occurring at the time, it was present in pagan Ireland before Roman contact, and likely still continued after it. The details of it, however, are unclear. Because the Irish were somewhat isolated from both Rome and the rest of the world, Irish society was not fractured when the empire began to fall. In fact, rather, the Irish saw an opportunity in the collapsing Roman Britain and began raids on it. Nevertheless, Rome's religion, Christianity, would not only outlive it, but would spread rapidly in the centuries following its collapse, with Ireland right in its sights. Christianity would transform Ireland and connect it to the rest of the world in important ways, and the man who would bring it there was first a Romano-Briton teenager captured as a slave by the Irish named Succat, better known by his Christian name, Patrick. There are a number of details missing from St. Patrick's life, such as when and where exactly he was born, and while many details have been filled in with myths, historians agree widely that he was a real person. Patrick was likely born in Wales or Western England in the late 4th century. At the age of 16, he was captured by Irish raiders and taken back to Ireland, where he worked as an enslaved shepherd for 6 years until he escaped and returned back to Britannia. During his enslavement, he held on to something which he formerly hadn't cared about much: his home religion, Christianity. Upon returning home, he joined the church, studying and working throughout France and Britain until his piety and dedication earned him an important assignment from the Pope, to travel back to Ireland and spread Christianity there. Patrick, of course, had plenty of reason not to go back to the country which had made him a slave, but also, in his eyes, plenty of reason to do so. He knew the Irish language, he knew how the people worked, he knew how the religion worked, and above all, he claimed to have received a vision from God in a dream commanding him to return. Patrick wouldn't be the first or only missionary to Ireland, but it was for these reasons that he'd likely be the most effective, so he went forward with it. He returned to Ireland, and though the Irish were not fond of him, he was able to escape or talk his way out of becoming enslaved again or killed or something of that nature, though in multiple incidents he came close. The Irish, particularly the kings and the druids, were not fond of Patrick coming and stirring things up, due to the importance of religion in this time period in Ireland. He was humble and generous, which eased concerns that this was an attempt to grab power. Despite opposition, Patrick is said to have converted and baptized thousands of people, and he ordained priests who would go on to found the monasteries of Ireland. He is said to have performed a number of miracles, most of them probably metaphorical, such as driving out the snakes of Ireland and converting Celtic warriors who are hundreds of years old. He used nature, which was already deeply a part of Irish life, to help the Irish understand Christianity. He also mitigated conversion by arguing that the values of the Irish had a greater place in Christianity and converted some of their customs and practices into Christian ones. One of the most notable examples of this practice, though not directly from St. Patrick, was turning the pagan holiday of Samhain into the Christian holiday of Halloween. Patrick would continue his work in Ireland until the end of his life. The importance of this was not only that the Irish changed religions. It in fact sparked a revolution in Irish society by connecting it with the rest of Europe. As the Dark Ages began to creep over Europe, an event which you can learn about in detail in my Dark Ages documentary, Ireland, which was formerly regarded as a backward and dark place, actually became an area of enlightenment and preservation of learning. At a time when only 1% of the European population could read, the monasteries in Ireland worked diligently on preserving the written works of Europe and spreading education and enlightenment. They did this to such a degree that many came from Britain and the European mainland to study in Ireland. Not only were these works in Latin, but they also wrote in Irish, an unusual habit as Latin was generally preferred to the vernacular throughout Europe. Though gradually becoming united under Christianity, Ireland was still not unified as a nation, nor would it be throughout the Middle Ages. In the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, however, larger kingdoms began arising on the island, such as Munster, Ullid, Connacht, and Meath. However, they were not nation-states as we have now, nor were they really actually kingdoms, because there was a sense that the land belonged to the tribe, not the kings. They were really groups made up of loosely united clans, tribes, and families, which they called the Tuatha, plural of Tua. One of the most powerful families in Ireland at the time were the Niall, the descendants of Niall of the Nine Hostages, one of the first great kings of Ireland, a figure of both myth and fact. This family would dominate much of the north. Governing the life of the Irish were the Brehon Laws, a unique set of laws which the Irish said were as old as the rocks, and which would seem unusual to us, as they weren't enforced by kings or state authorities, nor were they made by them. They were kind of held commonly. The Brehons, which were legal authorities in a sense, acted more like mediators than our modern judges. Laws applied to everyone, and in fact at times, the wealthier and more powerful you were, the more you paid for your crimes. Early Ireland placed great emphasis on the family and tribe, much less individualistic than the modern West, and thus the families of criminals were sometimes liable for certain crimes, at least financially, and would have to compensate the alienated family if found guilty. Though these laws were very ancient, they were effective and very organized, and they actually do not necessarily fade into a better legal system as we shall see. Rather, they meet the disapproval of the English. At the centers of these kingdoms were actually the monasteries. In a society still lacking major cities, monasteries were not only places of religion, learning, and study, but gradually became places of economic and political power. The church in this time period had no reserves about getting involved in wars, and in fact monasteries in Ireland were not only responsible for taking part in wars, but at times directing them against each other. Wars remained common. All able-bodied males, except for the well-educated and the priests, were expected to be available to fight for the kings in times of war. At this time as well, kingdoms began forming in England, Wales, and Scotland. Many of those in England were the formations of the Anglo-Saxons, a group of barbarians from northern Central Europe who gradually began taking over the remains of Roman Britain, laying the foundations for what would become eventually England. These Anglo-Saxons were, along with the Picts of Scotland to the north, still pagan, adding an ironic reversal of roles from the Roman era as now Ireland was the seat of Christianity in the British Isles. The Irish, who were religiously active throughout Europe, got to work on converting their neighbors. From the Kingdom of Dalriada, which spanned both Ireland and Scotland, Irish missionaries such as Columba ventured into the dark pagan wild to convert Pictland to Christianity. It's worth mentioning also that this was not yet Scotland. The name Scotland is actually an English misnomer, which comes from the Latin Scoti, which actually referred to the Gaels, and later the Gaels living in Scotland and then all of Scotland. In other words, the Scoti were Irish. Columba would have great success here, and would found the powerful and important abbey on Iona. Another important Irish figure of this age was Columbanus, who set up a number of monasteries in Europe. Debate exists about the legitimacy of the term Dark Ages, especially relative to the darkness of other ages. Regardless of the darkness of this era compared to others, however, Ireland was one of the brightest places to be in the first part of the early Middle Ages. In the late 8th and early 9th century, that would begin to change. As Ireland still continued in this era, and even as much of Western Europe was crawling out of illiteracy and intellectual decline under Charlemagne, new threats from outside Christendom began to close in. The greatest threat and impediment to the Irish were the Vikings. As you know if you've seen my other videos, including my documentary on the Vikings had a major effect on Europe, and Ireland was no exception. They came first as raiders, plunderers, and murderers, but later, as we shall see, they became builders and creators. The first attack on Ireland came in the year 795 on Rathlin Island, near Antrim, modern-day Northern Ireland. The Vikings attacked the church on the island, plundered what they could, killed the monks, burned everything, and left. A trend which was consistent throughout the Viking Age, similar to the famous raids on Lindisfarne just 2 years earlier, though these were not the same group of Vikings. While Danish Vikings preferred to focus on Britain and Charlemagne's empire, those who concentrated on Ireland were at first likely Norwegians. Ireland, much like Britain, occupied a very unfortunate position in the Viking Age. It was an island, and the Vikings were master sailors. Though the Vikings would attack other notable locations that year under the rule of Irishmen, such as Iona and Inishmurray in the late 8th and early 9th century, Viking raids on Ireland weren't constant. They were perhaps only once or a few times a year, with some years not seeing any Viking activity at all. Nevertheless, the raids struck fear into the hearts of the Irish. The Vikings could attack without warning, almost anywhere on the island. From out of nowhere, a group of large, ferocious warriors from a strange, unknown country across the sea could descend upon your village, and you could lose your home, your family, and your own life. They spared no one, there was no bargaining with them, and little means of stopping them. It took some time, but the Irish eventually began responding to this threat, and began beating the Vikings around 30 years after their presence was first felt. Though disrupting Irish society, the true permanent mark on Ireland came when the Vikings arrived not to raid, but to settle. The process of a heavier Viking presence on Ireland began in 837, with events centered around a Viking named Thorgest, who was said to have married a witch, performed pagan rituals on Christian altars, and committed a number of atrocities, though his existence is uncertain. One of the first major settlements was that of Dublin in 841. Dublin, which in Irish means Black Pool, would serve as the most important Viking stronghold in Ireland, one of the most important, in fact, in the British Isles, and would later evolve into Ireland's capital city of Dublin. Along with Dublin, the Vikings would also be responsible for founding a number of other major Irish cities, such as Waterford, Limerick, Cork, and Wexford. From these bases, Viking terror on the British Isles intensified. This period is remembered in Irish as Cogad Gadal or Galib, the War of the Irish with the foreigners. The Vikings came at an ideal time, as this was when the Nael in the north and the Munster Irish in the south were involved in a conflict, preventing a unified resistance to them at first. Cooperative resistance would come though, and in 845 it is recorded that the King of Meath, Mael Shecnail, captured Thorgest and drowned him. A united Irish effort was repelling Viking incursions, saving Ireland from complete Norse domination. Though Norsemen continued to move into Ireland, including now Danish Vikings, the death of Thorgest, or an equivalent great victory that again remains uncertain, disrupted an organized invasion, and around the year 850, a civil war erupted between two groups of Vikings. One side, whom the Irish called the White Foreigners, possibly Norwegians, led by a Viking known as Olaf the White, and the Black Foreigners, possibly the Danish, led by a Viking that the Irish called Imar, possibly Ivar the Boneless, the same Viking who would later be one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. The Irish were not only glad to see this division erupt, but also took part in it, with some, like Mael Shecnail, fighting what was in his eyes a holy war of expulsion. Another group important in this conflict were the Hiberno-Norse, or Norse Gaels, a group of people of both Irish and Norse heritage resulting from Irish and Viking interaction and marriage. Their existence was a sign of Viking permanence on Ireland. The Vikings eventually ended their civil war and announced a joint rule of Dublin in 857. In the eyes of many Irish, the Vikings would now be harder to budge. A unified resistance to the Vikings was losing ground, and Mael Shecnail would ultimately be unsuccessful in his efforts, and he would die of seemingly natural causes in 862, with Ireland divided between various Viking and Irish kingdoms, and his kingdom becoming divided among successors. These kingdoms would now not only interact, but form alliances against each other in certain circumstances. With their position now secured, many Hiberno Vikings would now focus on the much wealthier opportunities of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In the 870s, however, sources indicate that both Olaf and Imar likely died while campaigning in Britain, leading to a less vigorous Viking presence in Ireland. In 902, as a result of this, a group of Irish, under Mael Finna MacFlanagan and Kerbal MacMurrican, routed the Vikings from Dublin, essentially ending the First Viking Age in Ireland. This victory was short-lived, as the Vikings would return in 914, reclaiming Dublin and expanding in other parts of the island. Despite their return, they would not make much effort to control Ireland again, still focusing on England, and as a result, their power began fading in the early 10th century. The Viking invasion started coming to an end around the year 950, and this date is often considered to be the end of the Viking Age in Ireland, though not at all the end of the Norse presence in Ireland. The Norse still in Ireland, especially the Norse Gaels, as we shall see, remained active and retained their rule, primarily in the south and east, as they had been militarily unsuccessful in the north, albeit more as kings of nations than heads of raiding parties. Nevertheless, this would be the beginning of a slow process where the Vikings started to assimilate into Irish custom, speak Irish, follow Irish religion, and live like Irishmen. Around this time, across the Irish Sea in England, the many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were beginning to unite under Wessex, becoming a more modern Kingdom of England. Similar changes were happening elsewhere in Europe as well, and a movement to consolidate power under a single ruler in Ireland was inevitable. Such a movement would come from the ruler of a less powerful kingdom of Munster by a man named Brian Boru. Brian was the son of the king of Dalcash, Connedic MacLorcan. When his father died in 951, rule passed to Brian's older brother, Magaman. Magaman set about trying to become the king of all Munster, capturing the Rock of Cashel, the historic capital of the region. This naturally invited conflict with his Irish and Norse neighbors, and in 976 he was murdered during a negotiation which was claimed to be peaceful by his rival, Mael Muad. Brian inherited the throne, and set about trying to continue his brother's work. Brian is described as a born warrior. He had learned a considerable amount about not only Irish warfare, but also Viking warfare. As a result, he placed an emphasis on naval superiority. He would go to war with Mael Muad and the Viking kingdom of Limerick, defeating them both, and extending his authority across Munster. He would kill Mael Muad, but interestingly, his son Cian would be spared, and throughout Brian's life remained an ally. The Norse of Limerick as well, wealthy and powerful, were allowed to live peacefully, so long as they remained loyal to Brian. Brian then turned his ambitions outside Munster into neighbouring areas, specifically Leinster, Connacht and Meath. This would draw him into conflict with Mael Shecnail, King of Meath, who claimed to be the High King of Ireland. The conflict would be long and bloody, but by 996, Brian controlled Leinster and was proving himself to be militarily superior. This essentially forced a peace negotiation, with Brian laying claim of the south and Shecnail the north. Though peace externally had been secured momentarily, stability was threatened on the inside as well. Not all the kings of Ireland were content to recognize Brian as High King, and rebellion in Leinster occurred not long after this, aided by the Hiberno-Norse of Dublin. In a war ending in the year 999 at the Battle of Glenmama, Brian defeated both armies and captured Dublin as well, the wealthy center of the island. Now, Brian was ready to break the peace he had made with Checknail, and he invaded Meath, defeating the kingdom in 1002. Now the only region which Brian had to gain was Ulster, in the northeast. Ulster would not be quite so easily obtained, and at first Brian's armies were defeated. Much of his advance thus was left to cooperation with the Catholic Church, which was an elite in Ireland, notably by recognizing their authority and bribing them. With the church on his side, Brian would begin seeing more success in obtaining Ulster in the year 1008. By 1011, Brian had defeated the Connell Conall of Western Ulster. He was now truly High King of Ireland, or as the church called him, Imperator Scotorum, meaning Emperor of the Scots, or as you recall, Emperor of the Gaels. It is also around this time that he also received his surname, Boru, or in Old Irish Boruma. This is related to the modern Irish word bow, meaning cow. He was Brian of the cattle tributes. In a society where cattle were the symbol of wealth, this was a great title. Brian and the church were now seemingly beginning to realize their vision, a united Ireland under the authority of one king. Yet, there was still work to be done. It would be more correct to view Brian not as the king of a single kingdom, but the king on top of other kings which ruled their own kingdoms. Furthermore, while the Norse Gael kingdoms, like Dublin and Limerick, also recognized Brian as their high king, they were much more removed from Irish society and still functioned to a strong degree independently under their own law. How far Brian could have gone as High King of all Ireland remains uncertain, as not long after he accomplished this, it began to break apart. Discontented kings in Leinster and Ulster rose up in rebellion in 1012 and attacked Meath, and later Norse Gaels, specifically Dubliners, would join in on the rebellion, which would be led by Mael Morda. To make matters worse, as fighting intensified, Mael Checknail, King of Meath, betrayed Brian. The two sides would meet at the Battle of Clontarf, April 23, 1014. The battle ended with a mix of results. The Irish under Brian had won the battle, thus curtailing the power of the Hiberno-Norse significantly, an event which is often regarded as a true end of the Cogad Gala. However, Brian was actually killed in this battle. It's not exactly known how, but legend states that he was decapitated by a rogue Viking named Brodar, who cut through Irish lines and found Brian in his tent, then aged around probably 70, in prayer. Hopes of a united Ireland died for a time, with Brian Boru as contenders all began struggling for the throne. Brian's descendants, however, would continue to rule Munster. This family is known as the O'Briens, a name which, like the Ineal, who became the O'Neills, would persist throughout Irish history through the modern day and even into the 24th century. Brian's family in Munster made efforts to reclaim the title of High King, and his son, Duncan MacBrien, would claim the title, though it was not widely recognized, and he was one of many who would be known as a Riaran Cufrasarba, High King with opposition. While they made considerable gains and had notable successes, they would be ultimately unsuccessful, especially as his descendants turned on each other. When Miratok, who was Brian Boru's grandson, gave up his position as king, power shifted from Munster to Connacht and the O'Connor family, specifically Turla O'Connor. Turla set about trying to win the true title of High King, but had weak control over much of Ireland and never controlled Ulster. His son, Rory O'Connor, would succeed him, but he would face a united invasion from Leinster under Dermot MacMurrough and Ulster under Muratoch MacLachlan. As a result, he allied himself with Tiernan O'Rourke of Breffni, and war ensued. O'Connor and O'Rourke were victorious, and in 1166, O'Connor was crowned High King in Dublin. O'Connor ruled as a true High King, with the political and religious figures of Ireland all recognizing his authority. Dermot MacMurrough of Leinster, however, had escaped, and fled eastward with no intention of letting this be final. Dermot fled to England, and then to France in search of Henry II, grandson of William the Conqueror, the king of the Norman Empire, and subsequently King of England. The Normans, descendants of a mix of Vikings and French, were one of the strongest military forces in Europe. Unable to beat O'Connor on his own, he realized foreign aid would be the key to retaking his throne in Leinster. As a result of this, Dermot is often regarded by the Irish as one of the worst in a long line of Irishmen who betrayed their country for the favors of foreigners, namely the English. For now, Dermot was inviting a neighbor into his own nation with whom, unbeknownst to him of course, the Irish would quarrel for nearly 1,000 years. Dermot met with Henry II, and Henry agreed to support Dermot in exchange for his loyalty. Henry would not join Dermot personally, but granted him the right to recruit English soldiers and mercenaries for his conquest. Dermot found a number of powerful Norman allies, including Robert Fitzstephen, Maurice Fitzgerald, and Richard Fitzgilbert, known in his lands as Richard Arquefort, Richard Strongbow. Dermot offered Strongbow a very enticing deal in exchange for his help. He would allow him to marry his daughter Eva and would name him his successor as King of Leinster, effectively transferring rule of an Irish kingdom over to a Norman, loyal to another king. There was also money to be made and land to grab in Ireland, which Strongbow and his allies figured would enhance their power and prestige. Dermot did not introduce the concept of invading Ireland to Henry II. Henry had actually been considering it for some time, and even received support from the church, as Pope Adrian IV and Alexander III were concerned about the independent nature of the Irish church. However, he did provide Henry with an opportunity that he couldn't refuse. Dermot and Strongbow assembled an army of Normans, Saxons, and Welshmen, and attacked Wexford in 1169, though Strongbow stayed behind for the time. Dermot then began pushing further into Ireland, but was eventually met by O'Connor, who began defeating his forces. The two sides met at Ferns for negotiations, which were mediated by the church. It was agreed that Dermot could once again become King of Leinster as long as he continued to recognize Rory O'Connor as High King. Later, in private, they are said to have agreed to stop bringing foreigners into Irish fights, but it was too late for that. Strongbow arrived in 1170 and took Dublin, and began defeating O'Connor. As winter set in and the two armies ceased, Rory O'Connor began fearing that he wouldn't be able to best Strongbow. In May of 1171, matters complicated further when Dermot died. Dermot MacMurrough had essentially died before he could enjoy the rule of Leinster, for which, in the eyes of his countrymen, he sold Ireland's soul. Though, historically speaking, with or without Dermot, the Normans probably would have come to Ireland anyway. Dermot's son tried to claim the throne of Leinster in accordance with the Brehon laws, but Strongbow, who had married Dermot's daughter by this point, had been guaranteed the throne, and was militarily more powerful, succeeded him. This concerned not only the Irish, but King Henry as well. Henry was suspicious of Strongbow's motives, especially given that Strongbow's father was an opponent who had opposed his succession during a civil war known as the Anarchy in England. Now, Strongbow had married into the Irish nobility and ruled as King of Leinster. Unsure of his loyalties, Henry felt he had to invade Ireland. Though at first Strongbow ignored him, Henry was able to secure his loyalties with only the threat of invasion. Nevertheless, power in Ireland still remained unsteady. Strongbow's governance was disliked by the Norse Gaels, and the Irish kings and the Irish church were not very happy with the Norman arrival either, and would likely oppose it again, violently. So Henry decided to invade that year. Henry invaded with a force of around 5,000. These soldiers were highly trained and well armed and armored. Many Irish kings felt that resistance was futile, especially as they weren't only dealing with the English, but a force which had the backing of the Vatican. They thus began submitting to Henry, the first being Donald McCarthy, the King of Desmond. Gradually, much of Ireland fell to English rule, with mostly only the north holding out. In 1172, Henry began encouraging English colonization of Ireland and allowed Hugh de Lacy to push in the Meath. Ireland was now a nation of 4 languages: Irish, Anglo-Norman French, Latin, and Old English, which would have a lasting effect on the linguistics of Ireland. The Normans began solidifying their position in Ireland, as they had done in other regions, including England a century earlier. This, along with the Catholic Church moving into Ireland and pressing reforms, intermarriage, and attempts to reorganize the country territorially and legally by introducing feudalism and replacing Brehon law with English law, would have a permanent effect on Ireland as well. The English felt that they were civilizing Ireland, much like the Romans. The Irish weren't content with this. Wales, and though facing a stronger occupying force, would begin resistance and wars, marking the beginning of Anglo-Irish conflict, which would last for centuries. Though Rory O'Connor and Henry agreed to terms with the Treaty of Windsor, O'Connor failed to control the other Irish kings, and Henry at times failed to control his own Norman subjects as well. Many were busy carving out kingdoms and territories for themselves. In 1177, Henry made his son John Dominus Hibernii, Lord of Ireland, when he was only 10 years old. He would of course not assume command of his position until he was matured and trained, but in 1185, at the age of 18, he left England for Dublin. Much to his father's disappointment and the resentment of the Irish kings he was expected to rule, John acted like a clown. An example of this is that when he first encountered them, he mocked the beards of the Irish kings and pulled on them. When he got to work, ultimately, he failed in the conflicts against the Irish, wouldn't pay his soldiers, and failed to secure royal authority over the English settlers there. He left that December, returning back to England. In 1199, King John unexpectedly came to the throne. Ireland remained divided between English and Irish rule. Some lands were steadily English, but others much less so, and many areas of the country still defiantly under Irish rule. Though remembered as an insane and ineffective ruler in English history, John did work on capitulating Ireland considerably by reorganizing the system of governance on the island, ensuring loyalty to him. Nevertheless, rebellion, even among John's own subjects, would sprout up, and it is at this time that we see another feature of the Anglo-Irish conflict emerge. The Irish turned to the enemy of their enemy, France, for support. Though these rebellions were unsuccessful, for as long as England would control Ireland, England's enemies, specifically France and Spain, would take an interest in encouraging trouble in Ireland. The Anglo-Normans would continue attempting to expand into Ireland throughout the reign of Henry III, John's successor, specifically into regions such as Connaught, where High King O'Connor had originally hailed. This became more and more difficult as some Anglo-Normans in Ireland were ruling more and more independently, and others had lost interest in Ireland altogether. Furthermore, the Irish were adopting the technology and tactics of the rest of Europe, and working with Scottish mercenaries against English rule, allowing them to refuse to pay tribute and to raid the English lands, which was contributing to a weakening Norman presence on the island. Importantly, in the 13th century, the ideals of the English nobility, which had been emphasized in reaction to King John's tyrannical rule that eventually led to the Magna Carta, spread into Ireland as well. This became much more evident in the reign of Edward I when, in 1297, the Irish Parliament formed. This was not necessarily a move to grant the English in Ireland more independence, but rather was an attempt to ensure English law was upheld in Ireland, as well as English culture at a time when the English there were becoming worryingly Irish, a trend which would continue for centuries. It was also, though, a move to let the Anglo-Irish deal with their own problems, because Edward had enough of his own, namely in France and Scotland. Resistance under the leadership of a nobleman named William Wallace was beginning in Scotland. Tensions between England and Scotland were heating up, and Ireland would feel the effects of this and see opportunity within it. Independent Ireland and Scotland were at this time culturally, historically, linguistically, ethnically, etc. similar, and with a mutual enemy, a cooperative effort was likely to form. Edward I died in 1307 and was succeeded by his son, Edward II. In Scotland, a year earlier, Robert the Bruce had become king. The Lords of Ireland saw a potential ally in Robert the Bruce, and Bruce felt likewise, knowing that an independent Ireland could be crucial in defeating England. In 1315, Robert the Bruce, along with his younger brother Edward, devised a plan in their efforts to defeat England. Edward would take a force of around 6,000 soldiers to help liberate Ireland, and in exchange, the Irish kings would recognize Edward as High King. This would open up a distracting second front in the Anglo-Scottish Wars, and create what they called a Grand Gaelic Alliance, with Robert as King of Scotland and Edward as King of Ireland. From there, they could move into the Isle of Man and secure a similar arrangement in Wales and invade there. Edward landed with his army in May of 1315 in eastern Ulster. He was joined by Irish soldiers and began his campaign, seeing a great amount of success against the English there and kept pushing into English territory. Within a year, Edward was crowned King of Ireland. However, it was very premature. Unfortunately, this war in his second front had begun during a harsh time, a period of famine which lasted until 1317, affecting all of Europe with no exception in Ireland, where perhaps up to a quarter of the population succumbed to the famine. Feeding the troops was a major burden, and though Robert the Bruce's arrival in the winter of 1316 was encouraging, it only increased the number of mouths to feed, and by 1317, fighting between the two sides was slowing down as both sides lacked the ability to continue the fight. That year, the Irish began splitting off from the main Scottish army into their own movements, and when Edward failed to capture Dublin and Limerick, cities which were considerably loyal to England, the movement began to fall apart, and later in October of 1318, Edward the Bruce died in battle. Despite a technical English victory, Ireland was becoming too difficult to control. This war had torn apart English authority on the island, and English power began waning in the area over the course of the 14th century. Though controlling many parts of the island, the English monarchy only truly held power in the areas around Dublin. In 1327, Edward III came to the throne. He began attempting to bring order to Ireland once again, by various means, including increasing an administrative presence backed by a military presence and executing political rivals in Ireland, while viewing the Anglo-Irish with contempt and barring them from public offices. The Anglo-Irish protested, claiming these new reforms would bring instability to the island. Yet the policies held, but all the while, the Irish were constantly causing havoc on the borders. With instability and war constant in Ireland, the Black Death reached the island in 1348, exacerbating everything and killing likely over half the population of Ireland. The plague was most intense in the towns and cities, where English power was concentrated, and thus the native Irish gained more power and authority. By 1360, the situation was so desperate that the Anglo-Irish wrote to the king informing him that if nothing was done, Ireland would be lost. In response, Edward sent his son Lionel to Ireland with an army to restore authority, primarily to ensure Ireland's loyalty and economic profitability during war with France. Lionel was not greatly successful, and many in England complained that the resources required to hold on to Ireland far outweighed its economic worth, and even if it were worth it, England had more significant problems like France and Scotland, as well as the sicknesses and famines which caused havoc on the nation. By this point, the Anglo-Irish were becoming now truly worryingly Irish, as they were speaking Irish, dressing like the Irish, intermarrying with them, starting to follow Brehon law, and altogether living like the Irish. As a result, Lionel called together the Irish Parliament at Kilkenny and created a new set of laws, known as the Statutes of Kilkenny, concerning the lives of the Anglo-Irish. The intention of these laws was to bring the Anglo-Irish back to their English roots, by banning Englishmen from speaking Irish, dressing like them, interacting with them in various ways such as marriage and certain kinds of business, and even banning their Irish names, forcing them to anglicize them. This sounds like an effective means of bringing the island back under English control, but unfortunately for the English, they retained little power over the Anglo-Irish at this point, and the statutes didn't change much outside of the Pale, and in fact, it worsened tensions with the Irish themselves, who were now viewed as second-class citizens. Edward died in 1377 with the situation in Ireland worsening. His 10-year-old grandson Richard II succeeded him. When Richard II came of age, the Irish Parliament again called on the king for help, fearing the loss of the entire island. At first, Richard's focus was in France, fighting the 100 Years' War, but later in his reign he sought peace with the French. As for Ireland, however, he prepared an invasion to subdue the island by force. Ireland had become somewhat of an embarrassment to the English. It's said that when Richard was suggested as an heir to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, they basically mocked the concept of him being the savior of Europe from the Muslim Turks that the Germans needed, when he couldn't, in their eyes, even maintain rule of a primitive, inferior nation. In 1394, Richard landed in Waterford, bringing with him around 8,000 soldiers. He was the first English king to visit Ireland in almost 2 centuries. He had a great deal of success in reinstating royal authority, and tried to reorganize administration of the island again. Richard's success here wasn't gained through many battles, but more through a show of force and diplomacy. It seemed to have worked, but when he left in 1395, order started to unravel again, and the country turned back to division and warfare. When he returned in 1399, things did not go as smoothly. In fact, it was a completely different outcome. This was a time when the throne of England became much more unstable, and Richard's claim to it was uncertain, leading to a late response to what was going on in Ireland, and poor coordination of his campaign. The Irish, along with some Anglo-Irish, fought back against Richard this time, mostly through guerrilla warfare. During this unsuccessful campaign, Richard's rival to the throne, Henry Bolingbroke, took control of the throne from him, deposing him rather easily as he had become an unpopular king. Bolingbroke became Henry IV. Henry, who had kicked Richard off the throne, was now not keen on leaving it for adventures in Ireland, nor did England really have the funds to do so, leading to a continuation of the slow loss of English power in Ireland. Over the course of the 15th century, as famine caused by poor weather and plague hit yet again, English power in Ireland retracted to the Pale, the area around Dublin which was firmly loyal to England. Anyone living beyond the Pale was considered a foreigner, including the Anglo-Irish settlers, and in the eyes of the English, savage barbarians. In the eyes of the Anglo-Irish, English power was collapsing, and their slow integration into Irish society now hastened as they had to fend for themselves. In the eyes of the Irish, the foreign oppressor was retreating. Many returned back to England. The statutes of Kilkenny were irrelevant, and Gaelic rule was beginning to thrive again as Irish kings began to rise to power as they had in the olden days. Still, however, there was no Irish unity to expedite this process. The Irish remained divided. In 1413, Henry was succeeded by Henry, becoming Henry V, who would do little in Ireland, focusing instead on France. When Henry died from dysentery, his infant son Henry would succeed him, becoming Henry VI. Henry VI was a weak king who was viewed as incompetent and likely suffered from a strong degree of mental illness. He would lose the war in France and, more importantly, would lose his throne in a conflict that would make Ireland important to the English again, the War of the Roses, which divided not only England but Ireland as well. In 1449, Henry and his wife decided to position Richard of York, a potential threat to the throne in Ireland. This wasn't merely a banishment, as Richard was Earl of Ulster and had an interest in Ireland, but it was very much with the intention of getting him away from England. Nevertheless, Richard made the most of his stay in Ireland, befriending the O'Neills in the north as well as the kings of Leinster. This worried Henry, as Richard was gaining the support of the Irish kings who would potentially aid him in a conflict. Richard left Ireland in 1450, placing the Earl of Ormond, James Butler, in charge of his post. Unfortunately for him, however, the Earl died in 1452, and his son, also named James, the Lancastrian, the rival faction of the Yorkists, succeeded him. Regardless, Richard had the majority of the Irish supporting him. He had effectively done what the English had long feared, turned Ireland into a base from which a foreign invasion could come. In 1453, Richard had returned to England and took control of the throne while Henry was in the middle of a mental breakdown. His rule would not last, however, and while England came under the rule of Henry again, Ireland continued to recognize Richard as king, ignoring the rule of London, effectively making Ireland independent. Most of Ireland was with him, including primarily the Geraldines of Munster and Kildare. However, the Butlers, in particular, as I said, were Lancastrians. This divide would rock Ireland as it did England. In 1460, Richard returned to England, securing an agreement that he would succeed Henry VI, but it didn't last, and the war continued. Richard would die at the Battle of Wakefield and be succeeded by his son Edward in his efforts, who would later force Henry to exile in Scotland. In Ireland, events were culminating toward the Battle of Piltown, where the Geraldines and Butlers would face off. The Yorkist side would win and the Butlers would never recover, ensuring Geraldine power in Ireland. Thomas Fitzjames Fitzgerald was made head of the Irish government during this time accordingly, as the Yorkist Irish increased their wealth. He was much more of an Irishman than an Englishman, and favored traditional Irish culture and law, except in Dublin, where English rule was emphasized. In 1466, he was removed from power by the O'Connors, however, and was later executed on false charges, which caused further conflict. Unfortunately for the Irish, the Lancastrians once again gained power in England, but the Irish remained Yorkists. It would not be long before the throne went back to the Yorkists again, and Gerald became Earl of Kildare. Gerald would be known as Gerard Moore, Garrett the Great in Ireland, effectively ruling as king in all but name. Under Gerald, though war and conflict continued in many parts, Ireland entered a short period of development, trade, and relative peace. This began to change again in 1485 when Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian, finally ended the War of the Roses by securing the throne. He did not rule as a Lancastrian technically, rather as a Tudor, which was meant to be a house which unified the two. However, his position still meant that he viewed the Irish, who had opposed him, with contempt. Nevertheless, he allowed Gerald to keep his position, knowing it would cause unnecessary and taxing problems in Ireland if he did not. Despite this luck, Gerald and other Irish Yorkists favored a supposed heir to the Yorkist throne, Lambert Simnel, who was in reality a fake, which Gerald probably knew, to replace Henry VII, and actually invaded England to secure this. Henry crushed the invasion, but pardoned both Gerald and Lambert, and Gerald, who indeed had the luck of the Irish, returned to his post. Henry would later send an army into Ireland when the possibility of yet another threat from a fake heir came, and in 1492, Gerald was temporarily removed from office. Though he likely wasn't involved in this plot, his disloyalty in the past was enough justification. This period saw a resurgence of conflict, with the Butlers making a grab for power now that the Geraldines had been deposed. This conflict would concern Henry, who sent an army into Ireland again, and would put Sir Edward Poynings in charge of administration to work alongside Gerald, Earl of Kildare, who returned to power as the English realized he was a necessary evil in stably governing Ireland. Poynings would bring an end to any concept of Irish self-rule. During the War of the Roses, Ireland had been making many of its own decisions and laws, but now it had to go through the approval of the king in England, and could no longer be diversified locally. This would begin a reversal in England's gradual loss of Ireland. Until Poynings, Ireland had gradually been slipping from England ever since the time of the Normans, to the point at which it began operating independently in all but name once again. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son Henry VIII would further transform the relationship between England and Ireland, bringing the two nations closer together, but also driving the two peoples further apart. Henry VIII is remembered as one of the most important monarchs in English history, though certainly controversial. Henry's main legacy begins with the troubles of producing an heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine failed to give Henry a male heir after 7 children. All of them died young except for their daughter, Mary. Henry realized Catherine wouldn't likely produce a male heir, and thus wanted a divorce, which was a rare and often impossible concept in the 16th century, especially among nobility. The Pope, with pressure from the Spanish who wanted their marriage with England intact, Catherine was actually the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, denied it outright, and thus Henry, desperate for a male heir, joins the Protestant Reformation occurring in Europe and makes himself the head of his own Anglican Church, effectively breaking off from the Catholic Church. In July of 1533, Henry was excommunicated, and Catholic Europe, namely Spain, was beginning to view England as bitterly hostile. Henry's church would be founded in blood as he beheaded citizens who favored the Pope, officials who questioned his power, and even some of his own wives. Catholicism was not to be tolerated, and with Ireland under Poynings' law, Ireland was expected to follow through as well. But the Irish would resist, and saw this as an opportunity for rebellion. Rebellion would come under Thomas Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare, known as Silken Thomas, whose father had been imprisoned and killed by Henry. Henry planned to execute Thomas as well, but Thomas took up arms, and he declared Henry a heretic and launched what he called a holy crusade against him. He he was met by Sir William Skeffington, who commanded a force of around 2,300 well-equipped men. Silken Thomas was defeated by Skeffington. Thomas, along with much of his family and scores of his supporters, were executed by Henry shortly after. The situation in Ireland remained unresolved, though. The Pale, naturally, followed in step with Henry's movements, but Ireland outside the Pale was much less loyal, and Catholicism remained firmly rooted. Henry sent forces into Ireland to attempt to bring them more firmly under his rule under Lord Leonard Grey. But Grey was opposed by a coalition of Irish lords known as the Geraldine League, orchestrated by Menace O'Donnell. The League managed to even pillage the Pale, but was eventually put down by Lord Grey in 1539. Henry, as was his style, later had Lord Grey executed and switched to a tactic of negotiation with the Irish. He encouraged them to surrender and swear loyalty to the crown, and agreed to follow English law, customs, and culture. In return, he would guarantee them their lands under English law, grant them an English title, and ensure them a place in Anglo-Irish government. This offer applied to both Anglo-Irish and Native Irish, in an attempt to bring control to the whole country. Amid these changes to Irish society and increased English presence and rule on Ireland, Henry changed his title from Lord of Ireland to King of Ireland. This was effectively much more than a change of title. Ireland and England were now more clearly joined under a single monarch, and the Irish lords had a much more clear legal position. Henry was eager to rule Ireland more closely, and began a process that would begin to draw Ireland closer to England. After centuries of lackluster effort in Ireland by the English, why would Henry begin turning things around? Well, from the War of the Roses, he had learned the importance of controlling Ireland. A hostile Ireland had been the base of not only Richard of York, but later pretenders as well, and the Irish also nearly overthrew the English monarchy. Furthermore, Henry knew that a religious divide would threaten the stability, and the Catholic Ireland would open the door for the Catholic French and Spanish to use the island against England. Despite these efforts, however, as I said, Henry had little effect outside of the Pale, and many Irish nobility agreed to the surrender and regrant policy, as it's called, and later ignored it. Henry died in 1547. He had laid claim to all of Ireland and begun a process which would link the two countries further, but ultimately failed, as many monarchs had before him, to bring control of the whole island. It would be his successors which he led. In the next video, we'll look at the efforts of his short-lived son Henry, his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, and King James in Ireland, in a crucial period in English history. We'll look at how Ireland functioned under English and eventually British rule, and its uneasy role in the empire which would come to dominate the world, and later its effort to break off from that empire once and for all and become the nation it is today, or rather, nations, as the island remains divided for reasons we'll get into.
Thanks for tuning in to Pete Star TV. If you like this material, please put a comment down below, and please put a comment in the comment box, and please put a comment on the video. It'd be gladly appreciated. Pete Star TV.